Great to be joined again in 2023 by the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, the National Party Leader, David Littleproud. Thanks for joining us again on Flow, David.
Yeah, thanks for having me and Happy New Year.
Likewise, look, Murray Watt, he's your Queensland colleague from the Labor Party. He's the Agriculture Minister. You're the former Ag Minister. He's over in Europe spoken the benefits of possible trade deals, but you're a bit concerned about some of the language he's using over there.
Well, I am, and I think this goes to the ideology of the Labor Party, and I respect that they won an election, but that ideology is around restricting farmers and their rights and their use of the landscape. Now, I'm not for broad land clearing, but farmers should have the right to manage their landscape, and if you take away that property right, they should be compensated. But what we did in government was to have a carrot approach to say we created the world's first biodiversity stewardship program. They're currently negotiating a free trade agreement with the EU, and the EU is saying they want to put restrictions on us as farmers because they believe that we shouldn't be able to manage the landscape the way that we want to. They want it to be the way they want to, despite hundreds of years ago depleting their natural forests. They don't believe that any other country in the world should do it. Now, we're not saying we should do that, but I think what Labor is doing is they've said in the last two elections that they wanted to bring in national tree clearing laws. What that would mean is that there would be ways and that they would put on Australian farmers about how they could produce beef and sheep and make sure that that was harder and not as great in terms of quantity. So that'll push up prices, but it'll take away the earning capacity of farmers. And it means you'll pay more at the supermarket. And they're going to use these EU laws to say that we'll sign up to a free trade agreement with the EU and impose those laws on Australian farmers. Now, the EU, our trade with there has reduced over the last couple of years. It's only about 2.1 billion. It's gone down from about 4 billion, but they actually have over $6 billion worth of imports into Australia in agricultural product. So I think this is an opportunity to say to the EU, well, hold on. We've got the whip hand here. We're not going to blindly sign up to an EU free trade agreement if you want to impose on farmers, take away their rights to manage their landscapes appropriately with a carrot approach, to do it responsibly and sustainably. And if you don't sign up to our biodiversity stewardship program, well, we're not going to sign an agreement with you because our management of our landscape is better than what the Europeans are every day of the week. But I just think Murray Watt's going to use this because their ideology lines up with the EU, not understanding productions. Murray's a great bloke, but being a lawyer from the Gold Coast doesn't give you a great understanding of how well farmers do in managing the landscape.
Well, we don't want to take the lead from the EU about how they approach their own farmers when you consider the protests that have been in place about restrictions, if I recall correctly, on the pesticides they use and other chemicals.
But that is exactly the thin edge of the wedge. It's not just vegetation management laws. They will then start to impose conditions, and in fact, it's already happened in Queensland, my home state, where the state Labor government, if you're a sugar producer up in North Queensland, they have used the apparent runoff from sugarcane into the reef, when the science is actually demonstrating that actually, while there was a small amount at one time, it's actually been reduced and removed because our farmers manage the landscape and they don't want to spend money on chemical and fertiliser unless it's going directly into the plant itself rather than running off. So, this is already happening because in Queensland, the state government can tell a farmer in Queensland up in the reef or off the reef about what they can and can't put into the soil. So, these are the types of draconian things where there's an overreach of government. Yes, there needs to be regulatory guide rails, but there's this thing called common sense, and our farmers use it, and they are proud of the stewardship of their lands. And the EU, it's just hypocritical for them to try and impose, whether it be the use of chemicals or deforestation. When you think of what they've done to their landscape over thousands of years, they're just saying, well, no, you can't do it, but we can. And there's no penalty. So I think this is where we just got to square up with them. We've got to hold firm because there's other markets other than the EU. This place called Asia, and I tell you, it's done us pretty well.
David Littleproud, just walk us through something else you picked up from the EU about the product environmental footprint. We're talking with the CEO of Wool Producers Australia soon, and we see all these environmental activists and concern about microplastics going out into the ocean and killing whales and turtles and that sort of thing. But we would have thought wool and cotton are some of those products we'd be promoting as entirely environmental.
Yeah, but see, this is where ideology doesn't meet practical reality. Because what the EU is saying, and this is where the vegetation management laws and all these deforestation, they're saying well, we shouldn't produce wool and we shouldn't clear landscape to produce cotton, and we're not clearing landscape to any great scale anymore. That's a furphy. But what they're saying is, well, we'll give greater preference as an EU to synthetics. Now, last time I looked at a synthetic, you use synthetic substances to create it, and that actually has a burden on the environment, whereas wool is a natural fibre. And if you manage the landscape and improve the biodiversity while you manage that landscape and produce wool, then you actually have greater environmental credentials than what the EU is saying, well, we're only going to support synthetic fibres. This is how they're trying to do it, by imposing laws on us from Europe about how our farmers produce their food and fibre for Australians and the rest of the world. And this is where the insanity of ideology doesn't meet practical reality. And the EU, I mean, it's a basket case. Let's be honest. They've lost all sense of reality over there. And this is where Murray Watt, if he signs up to this EU free trade agreement and has agriculture in it with all these caveats on it, then we're going to lose out. And then it's not just for the EU. It means then for all our markets, we're then signing up to production systems on our farmers that just means they can't produce what they need to, and they go out of business. And this is the reality of where ideology sounds great, but when you hit practical reality, someone ultimately always has to pay. We're just saying use some common sense, and the common sense isn't coming from the EU. Let me give you 6-4 on that.
When it comes to, I guess, the farmers doing the hard work of producing the food in the instance of meat product, we've had one of our commentators on livestock for this year already indicate there could be bottlenecks because of a lack of staffing in the abattoirs, the meat works. Is this going to be another triumph of ideology over the practical needs of Australians?
Yeah, and unfortunately this ideology is being run by the AWU, who are the political masters of the Labor Party. And I don't know why the AWU has taken such a bent against agriculture. And it's just not at the farm gate, it's right through to your plate. And so they had a real aversion to our ag visa. In fact, they went to every embassy of those that we were negotiating with and said to those ambassadors not to sign up to the ag visa, do not send your citizens to Australia, because Australian farming families will exploit them. Now, what Australian does that to destroy the reputation not just of Australian agriculture and farming families, but also our nation? And I don't know why AW went against us so hard on this, but what's happening now is that investment decisions are being made, not just at the farm gate, where we're seeing in the hort sector where only about 60% of plantings are there, because you don't go and plant a crop if you can't pick it. No one's going to do that. So they're reducing the scale, but when you get to the processing sector, that flows through. And most of our abattoirs are running around 60 to 70% full capacity because they can't find people to work in it. Now, Labor's solution and AWU is to can the ag visa and just focus on the Pacific. Now, the NFF and COSBOA at the Job Summit, which I said I'd go to and I went to be constructive, they identified 172,000 workers are required to get food from a paddock to a plate. So through the processing, the whole supply chain. Now, the best they can come up with is 42,000 out of the Pacific, and Anthony Albanese signed up another 8,000 in the PNG last week. Now, you don't need a maths degree to realise you're still a long way short. And so their only solution is this, just to say you're going to have to do without. Now, if you've made big capital investments in the processing sector, particularly in abattoirs, it's pretty tight margins at the best of time, and that's why throughput is so important for a processor. They have to have the throughput of product to make sure they can stay afloat. And I can tell you that from personal experience. I used to be an agri manager, bank manager. So, this is where, again, the ideology is killing the investment in regional Australia and the processing sector right through to our farmers, because they're not giving us the tools we need to be able to produce the food and fibre, not just for our country, but to pay the bills in their exports. And we're just saying, drop the ideology, admit that you're going to need an ag visa. The numbers are raw. You can't hide from them. 172,000 workers, and the best you can come up with is potentially 50. But some of that Pacific, or that 42 out of the Pacific, is effectively being challenged as well with childcare, aged care, healthcare, so that we're sharing them. So there's not actually 50,000 between PNG and the Pacific plan. There's actually less than that. And so we are a long way short. And that means businesses are making those decisions not to invest. And I think what you'll see is also when they don't invest and supply is not there, your price is going up at the checkout.
Well, David Littleproud, a whole lot to take on when you get back to Canberra, and hopefully we can get that regional voice heard. It seems like a lot of the media tend to cover what's the concern for metropolitan people, but some serious issues you've highlighted for regional Australians.
Yeah, and look, we don't want to be negative. There's still a lot of good stuff happening in regional Australia. We just need government in our lives to let us get on with the job of doing what we do. We do a great job. We should be proud of that and let no bugger ever forget it.
Good on you, David. Thanks for joining us today on Flow.
Thanks for having me.